Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Hayes. I'm the managing partner of Hudson, Sandler, and I run our Russian business. For those of you who don't know us, well, it's great to see so many friends and clients here this afternoon. We are a strategic communications consultancy. We're supporting our clients on their international investor relations, on their major engagement internationally, on CSR, on crisis communications, and we've built a fantastic business in Russia over the last 9 years, which we're extremely proud of, and we continue to see great opportunities and high levels of activity returning in the market. I'm here with a number of colleagues. First of all, Maria Ignatova, who's been with us for 9 years and helped establish our Russian practice 9 years ago. Maria is now based in Hong Kong, in our Hong Kong office, where she works exclusively on supporting Russian corporates in Asia-Pac. I'm also here with Maria Shostakaya, who's there, sorry. And Maria is based in our Moscow office and is in London every month as well. She's splitting her time. There are 3 other colleagues. We flew in this afternoon, and me and Maria ran for the train and got it, and 3 of my other colleagues are arriving, Emily Dillon, Fern Duncan, Katia Parker, and they'll be at the party afterwards, so we hope to see you then. Like all of you, we're reassured to see the Russian economy returning to growth. We're reassured to see inflation falling. We're reassured to see the price of oil recovering, the ruble stable, the government able to replenish its reserves, and that's encouraging, we think, for the longer-term macro outlook. And we see that reflected in investor interest here in Russia. So we're very pleased to have Andrew Kramer here to talk about how he sees that landscape from his perspective at the New York Times. Andrew's been here since 2005, so you've seen a number of cycles, you've seen a huge amount, you know Russia and the business community extremely well. Before that, you worked for Associated Press for the Washington Post, and I see you at Oxford.
I was, yes.
So that's always very good, America to come over to Oxford. So we're very pleased, Andrew, to be here. We think it'd be fantastic to have this discussion rather than a talk. So Andrew's going to just say a few words about how he sees the landscape, and then we're opening for a general discussion. Andrew.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and hello. Thank you for being here this evening. I welcome the opportunity to talk a bit about the work of the Moscow Bureau of the New York Times, and I'm hoping that I'll also hear in questions and answers hear from you some good story ideas to follow up on for my own work. The Moscow Bureau is a relatively small bureau. We have 3 Americans and 1 Russian researcher and writer, and we cover the entire former Soviet space from the South Caucasus to the Baltics and Siberia out to Kaliningrad. This year, the Bureau won a Pulitzer Prize for a series of articles called The Dark Arts. The series discussed, among other things, Russian disinformation campaigns, which is as good a place as any to start a discussion today about what it's like to be a journalist in Russia. There's a lot of discussion from government officials about information war and information soldiers, where journalists are seen as information warriors. The process of reporting is not about fact-checking, about balance, but about attack and defense, where a reporter is either attacking or on the defense. And unfortunately, this is not just in Russia. The US government recently designated the television station RT as a foreign agent, and they were banned from Congress. So there's a dialogue on this theme around the world these days. And it's unfortunate because obviously it makes the work of reporters more difficult, and in Russia we still have access, we're still accredited, but it's sometimes difficult to visit, for example, remote border areas that require permits. And what I wanted to do was also make a little bit of a pitch, which is that in business reporting, it's to everybody's advantage to have the stories come out and to have good reporting taking place in Russia as elsewhere, and about various Russian companies. The more transparency you have in a market, the better it is for business. The lower the interest rates, the lower transaction costs, so that being accessible to reporters is actually good for business. And that's really why I came, is to answer your questions and to say I'm available to write about your companies and about the Russian economy.
Very good, Andrew. Thank you. Can I ask the first question? How do the people in this room get coverage in the New York Times? What are you looking for from them? What sort of stories, what sort of insights?
Good question. If I knew that exactly, it would make my job easier as well. The Times business coverage for the Business Day section is not the same as coverage by example, by Bloomberg or by Reuters, which are information news agencies, business news agencies, and they cover companies in every day and every little development. So sometimes companies will come with a relatively small news development, which they think is important. It is important, but it's not something that we'll be recovering. So really what I'm looking for is feature ideas, stories that talk about Russia, that say something about Russian culture, about Russian business, about Russia's economy, and oftentimes counterintuitive stories will work well. And there's so much grandeur in Russia and in Russian business. There's the Arctic, there's oil, there's Siberia. All these words are very resonant and interesting to people. As examples, I've written, I just met briefly a representative of Severstal. I went up to the Severstal factory a year or two ago and wrote about how the exchange rate had ended up being quite beneficial for the company, and how they were doing quite well even as the ruble collapsed. And that was a fun story in part because the factory was so engaging and interesting, and every story doesn't have to be about the big political and geopolitical topics of our time. So one approach would be to have an interesting company, have interesting things going on, and provide access to parts of the world or an industry that people don't usually see. So the short answer is I'm looking for feature stories and longer term projects where I would work together with the company to tell a story.
Very good. Question from the floor. Vladimir, having Severstal just been highlighted as an exceptionally good example of media engagement, you must have a...
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really delighted that you mentioned the story, and it has been really a great experience for us because, I mean, we're doing a lot in the city of Chernobyl, which is a mono city, like we're a couple of large industrial companies, and we're doing a lot of things to develop the city. So it's all the time definitely a privilege if out of all the cities in Russia, you're selected by such a well-known, definitely newspaper, and someone who not just monitoring the situation from Moscow, seeing some articles, but comes himself to see the plant, talk to real people. So we were definitely thrilled with this opportunity, and thank you very much for. But my question, I mean, on that and similar cases, I mean, how is it someone, your readership is global, definitely, you still bear the name in New York Times, which is like the financial center of the United States, and from many other angles, definitely the center. So what sort of stories are interesting to someone sitting in New York who has never visited Russia? I mean, you can definitely write about, can I call it certain stereotypes about Russia, right? Oil or geopolitics or whatever, but you're trying to find new interesting angles. So how is it just 3 people in Moscow plus 4 people in Moscow? How do you, out of this huge information flow you're receiving, right? You select the best ones, because how many articles on Russia do you need to provide each week or day or whatever, a month, for us to understand the competition? Thank you.
Sure, thank you for the question. There's no fixed amount of material we provide, but our bureau would typically have a story a day on average, or maybe a bit more, a bit less than that. And obviously politics is interesting. My colleague is writing now about the press conference of President Putin. But really the trick, because we're not covering every single story and every development, is a story that would make an interesting story if you were to tell it to your friend at a bar. And I know that doesn't sound like the most scientific criteria, but a story has to be engaging on a human level in order to engage readers. Because exactly, they don't know about northern Russia necessarily. They might not know about the topic you're going to tell them about until you start to tell it. And then that's when it becomes important to have good characters and a good a good narrative. And then if a story is important, it's also a way to judge it. So it's either very humanly interesting. I just met the representative from Rusal. I went to their sorting center and met women who every day they sort thousands and thousands of carats of diamonds. And yet they say they still love diamonds, although they've seen so many diamonds. So there's sometimes a human element once you visit a company or an industry that comes to light you didn't know about before. And then you select a story based on how important it is. So if it's important to an American reader, it's something about Russian foreign policy or Russia's economy that's just simply an important story, and then it would make the cut as well on that basis. So those are the two main categories. It either has to be very interesting for one reason or another, or it has to be important.
Has the Trump dynamic changed? That's
Absolutely.
approach.
Absolutely. Well, I think the Trump story is everybody is mesmerized by that story in all of its facets in the United States, and the New York Times has done quite well in terms of subscriptions, and I forget the exact numbers, but I think at least a 30% increase in subscriptions since the end of last year in the election. So it's been a business success for the newspaper. It's also an important story for Americans. So every day there are Trump stories on the front page, and the Trump-Russia story is also, it's a legitimately interesting story, and legitimately important story. So there's interest in it. Most of the Trump-Russia reporting comes out of Washington because the access here to leaked information is not as great.
We have a question here. Second row.
Just sort of follow up on that. Just in the wake of the recent Trump announcements or pronouncements about the press, do you feel like you still have access, and do you feel safe as a journalist? I mean, one of the issues when the CNN international thing happened was journalists around the world were put in jeopardy. And I'm just wondering whether in Russia this is a similar occurrence.
Are you referring to Trump's labeling of media as fake news?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is disturbing as a journalist, and I think that we had a story in our newspaper about how other leaders around the world are picking up on this theme and criticizing the work of journalists as propagandists. But I don't feel physically threatened. I do cover conflict zones, so I work in eastern Ukraine, for example, and when you're covering a war zone, you know that you're going into a situation with risk. In Russia, the risks are a little bit different. There have been instances of assassination of a foreign reporter, but this was quite a while ago in Russia. It's more about bureaucracy, about the risk of being deported possibly, or having access curtailed. And I don't, like I said, I think there's been some restriction of access, but nothing specific I could point out, maybe just a general reluctance to speak to foreign reporters, but in no way is there any risk.
I think the next question, second row, then we'll come.
I have a question on your side trips. You just mentioned Severstal and Rusal, and the diamond thing. Who do you contact more often? I mean, how often do you make side trips, say to this company's premises, and who do you contact with? I mean, do you contact PR department or investor relations? Because mostly in the room we are from investor relations. And second question, do you have any limitations on writing reports on any companies? I mean, sanctions. Do you consider if the company is sanctioned or not?
Thank you for the question. It really depends. Sometimes I'll just hear through a friend or a colleague about an interesting story and contact that person in the company. So it can be entirely informal. But the most typical approach is to call the public relations department at a company and say, I'm interested in writing about you. This is my idea. If you think it's interesting, let's do it. And that's how I usually get in touch. Investor relations, they'll usually say, call public relations. What are you calling me for?
Do you get people pitching many stories at you, Andrew?
Not really.
Except from Hudson Sandler.
Right. Not that often. As I say, there are people. There's news that's sent out, and sometimes it's just not important enough to cover, so we ignore it. But and there are no restrictions whatsoever for American journalists to talk to a sanctioned individual or official with a sanctioned company. And I'd do an interview with Mr. Session right now if he agreed to it. Yeah, there's no restriction whatsoever.
At the back.
Hi. First, small remark. You mentioned that your sales have been surging under Trump, and this is very coherent with Trump's message that the economy is booming under his leadership. So maybe that was part of the plan. But the question is that we all know that the perception of Russia in the U.S. or just wider in the West is negative, and we all understand, how it happens. But from your viewpoint, are there any parts of the Russia story which are not toxic, where perception is positive?
Thank you for that question. I think that New York Times readers have a good and nuanced view of Russia. There's, as you say, a lot of negativity in the geopolitics, but people are still interested in things going on in Russia. And I would say there's probably more about Russia that would be interesting that's outside of this Trump-Russia sphere of interest than people think. And even in business, even in the overarching business story is about sanctions, is about the tense relations, but our bureau has covered, for example, the incredible benefits to the farm-to-table food movement in Moscow of the counter-sanctions. So these small farmers suddenly found out that their cheese and so forth was in great demand because European cheese had been sanctioned. So there's always somewhere a silver lining or an interesting story. And I think that a lot is going on in Russia that could be that people would be interested in hearing about, and even possibly because it's counterintuitive, because it runs against the narrative, this overarching narrative. But it doesn't mean that story is going to go away, or that anybody's going to stop thinking about the Ukraine war, for example. There are 10,000 people who've died in that conflict in the last 3 years, are worried about electoral meddling, about cyber attacks, and all these sort of big geopolitical issues are not going anywhere, but it doesn't mean that they might be mentioned in the story. It doesn't mean that there are not other interesting things worth talking about.
More generally, Andrew, how positive or negative are you about the sort of longer-term outlook for Russia, economically, politically, its place in the world, just your overall overarching sense of where the country's going?
I think in the long term, very positive. In the short term, negative. And the question is where the middle is.
I read an interview recently with a U.S. journalist, investigative journalist, who said that his access to, especially government officials, and in some way a representative of state-owned entity has basically disappeared. And the only access and inside information that he's able to get is through Russian journalists that did keep some access. That government officials would just not talk to a U.S. journalist. Would you agree with that? Or you don't feel that is in such a strong way?
Well, I do think that there has been less access, and it's kind of a shame. When I was first here, there would be invitations from companies like Gazprom to, and I don't want to, maybe I just didn't get the email, or if I were in better touch, I would be invited on these sort of things, but we're eager to show their oil fields or their gas fields to foreign journalists. I've interviewed German Greff when he was Minister of Economy, and Lukayev before he was on trial, and so forth. In other words, I've had a lot of good interviews, but I do feel that there's less willingness or less eagerness to reach out to foreign media these days, from Russian officials, Russian state company officials. And I don't know if that's just a feeling that they don't think they're going to be treated fairly in the Western media, or they don't, or the foreign audience is less important. They're more concerned about the domestic audience. On political questions, the Kremlin has a daily conference call that any journalist can call into and listen to Peskov. So there's different forms of access that are provided. It's not on the Trump-Russia story. This is not a great place to be working on it because you don't have the same leaky congressional committees that you have in the United States.
As an American journalist, how do you perceive your audience? I mean, I'm just thinking about if a company say invites you to a side trip, right? Like Gazprom or whatever company, and most of the Russian companies are traded in London, at the London Stock Exchange, right? If you don't, of course, if you write something like very like some real news nobody knew before, everybody will reprint your article. But just on a daily basis, will it impact mostly American audience? I mean, your interview or side trip story, or also it will impact the UK audience as well, the European market. I mean, in terms of investor relations.
Well, the audience is a general audience, even for a business story. If it goes in the business day section, it doesn't mean that only investors in this company should be interested. As a matter of fact, it should be interesting to everybody. And so I think of my audience as just a curious person, really, and not in terms of how will this impact the company or the market. It's how will this person enjoy reading this story? Is the question. And sometimes stories they don't go any farther than that. I wrote a story about shampoo recently, or maybe six months ago. I forget exactly when this came out. And it might be a tiny investor and analytical community that follows the shampoo and consumer good markets that was very interested, but that was not the intent, really. So almost always the audience is the general reader, so it has to be interesting to the general reader. That's my approach. And our, like I said, Bloomberg or Reuters will be writing from a different perspective. You also do want to be high impact, so some stories are very have a very big influence. And this is not so much business reporting, but last summer I reported on payments to Paul Manafort, then the chairman of Trump's campaign, an investigative project in Ukraine, and within a week he was fired from his job, and now he's under indictment for related issues about his payments from Ukraine. And I think that story was interesting to everybody all over the entire world. That it didn't really have a target audience, but it was particularly interesting to Americans. So that would be the idea. I think most of our audience is American, but they're trying to have an international audience as well, and sometimes it doesn't matter if it's just a good story that everybody likes it.
Question at the back.
So to be relevant, it does want to be relevant for a business audience, and that would be great if there were business stories that the business community was very interested in. Was pick it up and read it with interest, something about Russia. That would be a goal. So if anybody has a good story they think people should know about, please let me know.
So there was an article in the Times today about Trump and how the Times documents more than 100 misstatements or lies that he's made since his inauguration. And they showed it compared to Obama, which lied 10 or 15 times during his entire presidency. But that leads to my question, which is, in this environment, the truth is fluid. It shouldn't be fluid, but it's become fluid, and audiences need to be shocked to believe something, maybe? So does that change how, not only the stories of Russia, but in general, stories that you guys write, do you have to make them more surprising? Do you have to make them more headline grabbing? Is that a consideration that your industry must be changing because of the Trump effect?
Thank you for the question. I'm in an outer orbit of my company here in Moscow. I'm sitting in headquarters, but I sort of keep up with some of the chatter. And one strategy for the newspaper has been when everybody zigs, they zag. And so when other newspapers went to local reporting during the crisis in the American journalism industry and after the recession, or even before before that, the Times went to international and national reporting and distinguished itself in that way. And I think that the authority of the brand is actually helping it in this environment. And I saw a post on Twitter from one of the editors about the results from the Alabama election. There were 13 million views of the New York Times results page, which just had the same results as everybody else, but they were presented nicely, and they said the New York Times. And it just means that people believe the brand. So the most boring thing imaginable, a bunch of statistics, are marketed well because of the authenticity. So that would be a counterexample to being more tabloidy. I do think that some issues of headline writing maybe, and the way stories are presented in social media might be influenced by this environment, but it would never go to the point of trying to shock with something that's doesn't deserve shocking.
So a somewhat related question. In the financial industry here, we had a tremendous sort of wake up in 2008 when we discovered that in fact we weren't doing the right things for clients, and in fact clients didn't trust us. I used to trust the mainstream news until you got the election last year so wrong. And now I don't know what to believe. What are you doing, or what have you seen here on the periphery of the company that's affected the way you actually do your job in order to rebuild that trust and that connection with readers? Is there specific stuff?
Well, they've gotten rid of that meter, but I'm really not, like I said, I wasn't covering domestic politics. I think that that poll meter was disappointing to a lot of people because it wasn't accurate reflecting some of the issues with the polling. I mean, it was an actual, it was an algorithm or a program that reflected actual poll results, but it was obviously deceptive because the results were quite different from what was predicted. And the thrust of the reporting was, as far as I could tell, sitting here reading it, there was the sort of the sense that Hillary was going to win, and that wasn't the case, although she did win the popular vote. So it was a surprising outcome for everybody. I think that the way you build trust is by consistently having a truthful product, and that's what it's done. That's what's done. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm not able to articulate this better because I'm not covering domestic politics, but I was pretty shocked by that. I thought that meter was a mistake from the beginning.
It wasn't just the meter, it was sort of my faith in the New York Times plummeted. Not because of the meter, but the whole coverage of the process.
Well, if we could talk a little bit about another presidential election that's coming up here in Russia, and how knife-edge you think that might be, and how you think you'll be approaching it, and how important it is in the Russia story from your perspective.
Well, most of that coverage will be done by the bureau chief here, who covers the Kremlin and Kremlinology. And I think that'll sort of just slip by, as my sense, in terms of its importance for business. It's not such a barrier where economic policy will be taken before or after the election, as in some other countries. Maybe there'll be a bit of populism before and a bit of less popular decisions made afterwards on the pension age, for example. But on raising the pension age, which is one of the reforms people think might be necessary to help the economy. In general, I think that the impression is of kind of a Putin and then a bunch of sideshow candidates, and until that changes, that's probably how it'll be covered.
Maybe a bit walking away from politics. All media now are online, basically, right? And what mainstream media, in your opinion, has the best, the most modern and advanced online presence, apart from your own media? Or in other part of the question, don't you feel that all mainstream media need to do much more about their online presence?
Yeah, I do. I'm just I'm sort of a worker bee, and I provide the material, and how it's presented is not so much my my area of expertise, but I do know that print is still incredibly valuable in terms of the amount of money that it makes from advertising. And print advertising is going down, but it's still the advertisements that are placed around even a small story that I write, for example, could be maybe $50 or more $1,000. A page is I think around $100,000 of advertising, whole page of advertisement, and so it shouldn't really be dismissed. Print is still an important part of the business. In the online. One change that I think people have noticed is that journalists should be looking for either important and quick-moving news stories and get them up very quickly. So you can't wait till the next day to write about a news development. But counterintuitively, people are also interested in long, in-depth stories or high-quality investigations, and they'll read these sort of stories on their phone and online. So what's dropped out of is some of the middle stories, the stories that nobody really cared about anyways. We don't know why we wrote them, in an election in Azerbaijan or something like that. Will sort of drop out of the coverage. And I think that's one technique to catch the online audience, either very fast or very deep, and you have to do one of those two things and not fall in the middle. In terms of the sort of bells and whistles, I think visual is very important, and sometimes now the newspaper will assign a photographer to cover a story without a writer, which never used to happen. We had our photographer, Sergei Ponomarov, went to Norilsk to do a photo essay on the Norilsk mining complex in town. And the writer wrote some words for it later, but the main point of that exercise was the photos. Same thing they sent Sergei to do a photo essay on Volgograd. So those are some adaptations I think that are made for online, and if anybody has any things I think are incredibly visual or interesting visually, that's something to keep in mind.
Question from the world of the arts.
Yes. Good evening. My name is Ksenia Podolnitsina. I'm doing analytics and research of the Russian contemporary art market. And I would like to ask you your opinion. Do you think that contemporary art could improve the image and branding of the country, like for example in China? And would it be an interesting topic for you, like the volume of the market, dynamics, tendencies, so that people would know at least something about Russian contemporary market? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be very interesting. It might be something that our culture desk would cover, but I think it's interesting, and anything that adds to the understanding of Russia as more than just a monolithic structure, all about geopolitics, is great in my mind. So, absolutely.
Very good. I would have to say, working with Andrew, working with the New York Times, there is a huge appetite for looking at things that aren't stereotypical. So I don't think, in my experience, not approaching things with stereotypes and looking for things which are different, give real insight. So that fits into that, actually.
I have a follow-up question on your idea of the fast stories versus the in-depth stories. How does the fact-checking process work for you, particularly on the fast stories? I just think when there's something that you really know as a reader, that you really know in depth very well, oftentimes what you read about it in the press, you look at it and you go, well, that's not exactly how it works. How do you counteract that, and particularly for the fast stories?
It's always a challenge, and the goal, of course, is that somebody with a lot of knowledge about the topic would find it interesting and accurate, as well as somebody who's just approaching this topic for the very first time would find it interesting and not too dense and technical. The fact-checking is up, the ultimate responsibility is with the reporter, so you have to get the information first, the first time, and when you send it in, you're responsible, and if fact checking is done, I only benefit from that, of course. But at the end, the responsibility is for the reporter to get it right, and the person whose name is on the story is responsible for it. A longer-term story will have more time to go through and double-check and call people back and so forth. But on the other hand, a longer-term story might also be probing into an area that's not as public or where your sources are not as cooperative.
Very good. So I think that has been very interesting, Andrew. Thank you very much for coming, taking the questions, sharing your thoughts. I think, Yuri, we're having drinks shortly, and I know that Andrew's joining us for drinks. You can have a chance to chat one-on-one. But thank you hugely for coming today. It's very much appreciated.
Sure. Thank you.
And I'd also like to say from Hudson, Sandler to Yuri, Sergey, and the team, thank you very much for organizing this session as well.
And just on a technical note, you can find our email and our phone number here in Moscow. Please get in touch if you ever have anything that you think would fit the categories that I've discussed.
Дорогие друзья, спасибо всем за ваше время. С вашего позволения, перед тем, как мы перейдем вниз, приступим к нашим коктейлям, хотела представить нашу команду. У нас тоже здесь большая команда коллег. Поблагодарить всех, в частности Юру и Сережу, за то, что они организовали данное мероприятие. Без них это было бы невозможно. Вот. Но также хотела бы представить тех коллег, с которыми, возможно, не успели познакомиться. Еще раз Энтони Моро, наш руководитель. Наша главная юристка Лорен Пау. Lauren, can you stand up again and introduce the team so that people know who you are? And another colleague of ours, I'm not seeing him because the light is in my eyes, Hamish Parvati from Corporate Trust. And of course, Karen Bodner, but you of course all know Karen because she just spoke. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for your time, for the preparation. And I'm glad you chose us over the press conference of Mr. Putin.